Welcome to week 4 of Turf Equipment Operations 101. Today we're going to be talking about specialty golf course equipment. First thing we're going to talk about is a sand trap rake. Very typical on golf courses, although a lot of golf courses choose to rake the traps by hand. We'll talk about that and go from there. So here's a picture of 3 different brands of sand trap rakes. I've actually worked with all 3. I have my preferences, which probably is just more an indication of myself than anything else. One of the things that I do like is I do like a sand trap rake or bunker rake with hydraulic motors on the wheels. I think they're just easier to use. I think they're quieter, and I think they work better. So all of them will, if they have drive motors, will typically be 3-wheel drive. You can get 2-wheel drive. I'm not sure why you would. The cost is hardly any different, but there's one of the brands has a typical 2-wheel drive system with a belt and flywheel, that sort of thing. I prefer the hydraulic drives. One of the things that they will have in common typically is ultra low pressure tires, typically in the 10 to 12 psi range, high flotation tires. They will have a lot of the equipment we looked at has not had much tread on the tires. These will have pretty good tread to make sure that they can go through the sand. Some of them will have a sand prepper. That can be done in a difference of ways, but the sand prepper basically will loosen the sand up. It will, and that's one of the advantages, I think, of a sand trap rake, is that when you loosen the sand up and then rake it, it fluffs the sand up a little bit. It keeps it from getting too hard packed. And when you continually rake them by hand, sometimes that can be a problem where it can get too stiff. Then they will have sand rakes, typically on the back edge of the unit, that float to basically just rake the sand out in a nice pattern. Now, as a golf course superintendent, when I would train someone on this piece of equipment, my biggest caution to that employee would be to not go too fast. It just doesn't rake well when you go fast. So once again, I remind them, you're paid by the hour, not by the job, and we're looking for quality. We do want some quantity of getting things done, but we're basically looking for quality. Bunkers, and we're going to talk about a couple of other things too, but bunkers are one of the common complaint areas on how they're raked, also what kind of lip they have, that sort of thing. So they're an item that you need to pay attention to. Some of them will have a cultivator, and that could be something that is added on or not always on there, but basically that would go to whatever depth you set it out, and basically cultivate a little bit deeper than the preppers would on the sand. Typically the preppers might be just spikes that stick down that loosen up the sand, where a cultivator will actually go down, and if there's any grasses or weeds or anything like that, it can remove that. Some of them will have, if you go back to the pictures that we looked at, you can get some with a front blade and use them as a kind of a utility vehicle for moving sand and dirt and things like that. And then some of them might come with an optional scarifier, once again, for removing stuff. You'll see some of these cultivators, front blades, and scarifiers on bunker rakes that they actually use for infield preparation for baseball and softball. And then I've even seen a couple of these with an edger wheel that you can use. And the reason that they do that, sometimes for edging the side of the bunker, I haven't felt that that works very well. But I have seen a couple of these used with a wheel that you can raise and lower that's on a spring, so it can move a little bit. But those can work really well on cart paths. So the next one that we're going to talk about is a leaf vacuum, which is different than a leaf blower. I've had both. They come in three types. They can either be self-propelled, they can be an attachment to a tractor with a PTO, which is a power takeoff, where it gets his power from the tractor, or an engine mounted. And I've used all three of these. One golf course I was at had a self-propelled leaf vacuum, and it was okay. A little on the small side. It just seemed like a lot of money for having it self-propelled. Most of the ones that I've seen are PTOs or engine-mounted pull-behinds. So there would be an example of a pull-behind with its own engine mount for a vacuum. Obviously, if you look at that, the very front of the unit is where the engine is and the vacuum head, and that simply cycles all the material up into a hopper that can then be dumped. We ended up, the one we ended up getting stuck with vacuuming the parking lot a lot of times, which I really didn't want to be part of our job, but because we had that piece of equipment, we did that. The next one would be a leaf sweeper. And once again, they can be self-propelled, power takeoff, or engine mounted. They're quite effective, especially if you look on this part here. I'm using the cursor there to show the leaves, and then behind it how well it cleans. And it typically will have a series of fingers that are usually rubber tipped, and it goes in a circular motion, kind of like a broom, like a circular powered broom, and it simply lifts up all of the stuff that it goes across and puts it in a hopper. Now, one of the things I will say about a leaf sweeper is that they have limits as to what they can pick up. They're great for small stuff, little small twigs and leaves and things like that, but bigger branches and things like that, they just don't work very well on, because that's not their intended purpose. If you have very many leaves, a unit like this is extremely helpful and saves a lot of time. This particular one, if you notice, I'm going to show you with a cursor again, the arms on the side of this can actually lift the whole unit up and then can dump it in the back of a truck, which is pretty cool. A cedar slicer, we talked about this a little bit last week. Powered discs thatch the ground and leave slices. Seed is dropped through the tubes into the slices. Typically these are power takeoff units, although I have seen a couple of engine mounted ones. That's probably, that's an old photo, but that's probably one of the most common ones that we've ever seen. So this particular one has in the front unit kind of like a little bit of a dethatcher, discs that go through and do that, and then behind it, it has these discs that go in the slices, and up here is the grass seed, and it has, you can see across here, the little tubes that will then put the grass seed on the disc, and as the disc goes into the ground, it leaves it there. And then the rake, this little piece of chain link fence behind, is to just kind of spread out any debris that it might leave. Air fryers, we talked about that last week also. We looked at some Greens air fryers. This is more of a large scale fairway unit that they're pulling behind a Cushman. We've talked about all the benefits of aerification. Another type that we looked at is the Greens type of aerifier. And they make several versions of these in different sizes and things like that. And one thing that I think technology has shown us, that some of the newer ones just go a lot faster, which is kind of nice. We talked about this last week too as a water injection aerifier. When you're actually running this on the green, you have to have water hooked up to it, either from a tank or a hose. these wheels here, they rotate up, and it runs on this roller right on the turf. Vertical mowing equipment. Vertical mowing is defined as cutting slices in the turf with a machine that has blades mounted on a vertically rotating shaft. Vertical mowing is an important method of thatch reduction. And we talked about this last week too, how you can have all kinds of different vertical mowing equipment. You can have some that dethatch and some that just kind of go a very little ways into the turf just to maintain the surface free of thatch. Once again, I also think that this is really great on greens because it has a tendency to take the grain out of the green, and I think it makes for a much better putting surface. Pretty big fan of these. That's not a great picture. That one's okay. That shows. And if you notice, now one of the things, look at, if you can kind of see this, all of the debris that's being pulled up by this machine from this same surface, and yet it's not cutting any of the top part of the grass blade. So this was some units that we had were like this, that would replace the greens mower reels, and you would put 3 of these on a triplex greens mowers, and you can kind of see these blades that would go through. Now obviously you can set different depths of this, and so if you're trying to remove thatch, you would set it deeper, and if you're just trying to maintain, you would set it pretty shallow. Usually when we would do this, we would go behind it with a regular greens mower with blades on it to pick up the debris that it would leave behind. So another option that we have for vertical mowing is what is called groomers, and it's kind of hard to see, but the groomers, yeah, they basically have this, but instead of being reel sized, it is roller sized, and it's right behind the roller, and it's really hard to see, but it's just a miniature version of this right on the greens mower. I've had these units. It makes them very, very heavy, and you can overuse them. In a consumer unit, it would be what we would call kind of a dethatching machine for home lawns. But once again, you notice this isn't cutting any of the top turf. Look at this dead brown material that it's pulling up as it goes across the surface. Smoothing equipment. Okay, smooth roll. This is pretty common. This is an old version of one, and there's others, but this has been popular for probably the last 25 years when they discovered that as green speeds increased, there's a few ways to do that. Most of those ways to increase green speeds are pretty detrimental to the health of the grass plant. You can lower the cutting height. Well, that's fine if the grass is designed to do that. So for example, grasses that we had 30 years ago or 40 years ago were not not sure what the right word is. They were not bred to cut as low as some of the newer grasses. So if you have a brand new golf course with brand new grass on it, it can probably be cut lower than a 40-year-old golf course or a 50-year-old golf course. Now, that's one of the main ways to increase green speeds, is to mow lower. But if the grass isn't designed to be cut as low as you might like for the green speeds, there's got to be other things that you could do. So for example, a golf course starts out with creeping bent grass that's meant to be cut really low, but another golf course, a neighboring golf course, over a period of time has turned into annual bluegrass. Well, it doesn't do as well. It can be cut really low, but it doesn't stay as healthy. So there are ways that we can manipulate our fertilizer practices. Remember, nitrogen is associated with shoot growth, so we can cut back on the nitrogen and speed greens up. And I've done that before, but for just a short time, single purpose situation. So I hosted in 1979, I hosted a national USGA tournament, and we wanted to make the greens faster than normal because of the caliber of play, and because the greens were really, really large and they were not overly undulating. So one of the ways to make it a better test of golf was to speed up the greens. Well, we used to triplex greens more, and older grasses, and we were cutting well above 1/8 of an inch, closer to 1/4 of an inch. And so one of the ways, and we didn't have rollers, so one of the ways that we were able to speed up the greens was to cut back on the nitrogen fertilization right before the tournament, and we did that. And so to get the color that we wanted on the greens, we just used about 4 days before the tournament, we used iron on the greens. There's a story in that I'll tell you sometime, but I'll leave that for now. But so for the tournament, the color was really good, but the grass wasn't growing. The other way we were able to get the green speeds up is we mowed more than once. So we might mow one way and then mow another. And surprisingly, even if you're using the same exact mower, you will always get some more grass when you mow a second or third time. And eventually, towards the end of the week, towards the end of the tournament, we were instructed that they didn't want the greens any faster. So once again, we did that by how often we mowed. So I should say that these rollers, these have heavy rollers here that go across the green, and you would think, well, is that detrimental to the turf? Every study I've ever looked at, every study has shown that rolling is not detrimental to the turf in any way. And in fact, there's several benefits from rolling. So, for example, you want the grass a little longer because the roots go a little deeper. There's a little more surface for water, air, and nutrients and things like that. And so you roll it. So several golf courses will roll 3, 4, 5, 6 times a week to help increase those green speeds. And it really does work. And most every golf course I know at this point in time probably rolls. Pin placement equipment. So let's talk about cup setting philosophy and things like that. This probably generates more comments from the golfer than any practice on the golf course. Sometimes how wet the golf course is can make a difference, but this one really generates a lot of comments from the golfers. So this is a job that I just won't let anybody do. So most of my career I would either do it myself or I would have a specific person trained in how to do that. This is one job that I do not think you should try to do too fast. So we move the pin placements on the greens to disperse wear on the putting surface. That's one reason we do that. One year at the golf course I was at in Portland, it's now called Heron Lakes, we had, even for Portland, we had a long cold spell of frozen ground. But yet we still had golfers that were playing. And at one point I talked to the golf director and I said, we can't move the pin placements. The ground is frozen and it's getting worn out. I want to shut down the play. And he says, absolutely not. You're not going to shut down the play because we need the revenue from that. So the end result was that not moving that pin placement for several weeks because of the frozen ground, even though there are people playing golf, even if it's cold and sunny, you will have golfers out there. We had wear spots around those pin placements because they were there too long. So one of the main reasons we do that is to disperse the wear on the putting surface. We also want to provide a variety for the golfers. They don't want to hit to the same place every day. So we do that. And we used to have kind of a rotation. There's different philosophies on that. The rotation that I used was having it at least typically 12 to 15 feet away from the previous hole location. And we would try to have a mix of front, medium, and back locations, and as long as we followed that rotation, that kind of took care of itself. The other philosophy is Do we, we want to have a third easy, a third medium, and a third harder holes? And that, of course, depends on who's playing that day. We might go a little more on the easier side on ladies' day than on men's day, just because of the skill level of the golfers. So, how this works is the cup and the pin are removed. Now, I'll show you the equipment in a little bit, but there's a cup puller that can reach down there. After you take out the flag, you can remove the cup. A new hole is cut. Usually it takes 2 cuts. Unless it's a lot of sand, then sometimes 1. The material from the new hole is then placed in the old hole. And then the cup and pin are placed in the newly cut hole using what we call a cup setter, and I'll show you that. And my guys would get warned a couple of times if they weren't using the cup setter. And the reason you use a cup setter is it fits the exact interior diameter of the cup, but it puts it down to a certain level. But typically when you put the cup setter down, then you stand on it, and what it does is when you've pulled all that dirt and sod out of that hole, you've tended to lift up the edges. Now think about if you're putting to this hole and they didn't use a cup setter and they put the cup in and the pin in, you go to that hole and the putt's not quite center, it's off a little to the side, but instead of going in the hole because it's lifted up, it rolls off to the side. As a golfer, you're going to be ticked about that. So we always want to make sure that turf area gets pushed back down. So, cup cutter, a cup puller, a cup setter. Those are kind of the main things. So if you were to go online and look at standard golf equipment or par 8 golf equipment, they would have all of these examples for you to look at. I'm sorry I don't have pictures of those, but they would have examples for you to look at of a cup cutter. That's kind of a machine type of thing. A cup puller and a cup setter. Doing pin placements, I'm going to say that size matters in terms of how big you are. It's sometimes easier if you're a little bigger to cut down through that hole. And some of them will have a collar on the top that you can set. It's pretty nice, especially for newer employees doing this, where it only allows you to go so deep. And so that the goal is that when you take the sod and the dirt or material, sand, whatever it is, out of the new hole and put it in the old hole, that you have to be very, very careful to make sure that the new pin or the old hole is level with the turf around it. So I would take my cup cutter, I would have a bucket with typically sand in it. I would have a cup puller and a cup setter in that bucket. I would go, and when I would put the new cut soil and sand and sod into the old hole, I would check its level, and if I needed to, I would pull it back out or part of it back out, and I would add sand somewhere in the middle of that and put it back down to where it was level. If you're too low, you can imagine what that does if you putt across it. If you're too high, the next time you mow it, you're going to scalp it. So this is a job that I have always felt required really good attention to detail. Not only in terms of how you perform the actual job itself, but the choices you make of where to put the pin. My preference is to have someone who plays golf do this job, someone who knows the game of golf. Preferably someone who's good at the game of golf really helps, so that they don't put it in an unfair location. I can remember one time I was at the Heron Lakes, and my golf director was with me, and we were talking about an upcoming tournament, and we were going around the golf course looking at things, and I had noticed as we were going around that, man, all of the tee markers were back, and the pin placements were hard. So my rule is, that you have to be at least 12 feet from the edge of the green. Now, there's no rule that says that. There's no rule that says how far from the edge of the green the pin placement needs to be. So you could put it right on the edge if you wanted, I suppose. But I always felt that 12 feet was the good thing. And I used to have a thing with my employees, the ones that would set up the golf course, that I could challenge them. And if I challenged them, we would take a tape measure out there, and if it was less than 12 feet, they had to buy me lunch. If it was more than 12 feet and I challenged them, then I had to buy them lunch. Now, most of the time, I didn't collect on the lunches. I didn't push that, although a couple of times I paid for lunch because I felt pretty strongly about that. But that gave them some incentive to make sure that they were at least 12 feet or 4 paces from the edge of the green. The other thing that I like is when someone is going out to set the golf course, I like them to look for ball marks and fix those as they go along. And maybe even if they see a candy wrapper or some debris on the golf course, they'll pick that up as they're going around. That is the one job where you really get to look at the grass on the green very, very closely. That's why it's so important to have a really quality employee that's doing that job. Once again, it will generate the most complaints of any job on the golf course is the pin placements, and especially if people think they're not fair. So it's a very, very important job. At some point, for those that are on campus, we will actually go out and do this. So the second part of this is some small turf-related equipment. Just, kind of those things that you got to have. So, edgers. You've got sidewalks and patios and driveways and things like that you need to edge. So you got to decide kind of the size of the area and the power type, and how big it's going to be. Also, what's the configuration of it? If you have one, say, with 4 wheels on it, or that can be hard to turn. So if you've got a lot of sweeping turns and things like that, curves, that might not be your first choice. There's other types that you can use. And how much freeform is there? Or is it if you're just doing a straight sidewalk, that might dictate one piece of equipment, but some of the others might dictate other types of equipment. Now, I will say that one of the things that we didn't used to do that we do now is we use weed eaters for edging. And someone who's really good at that can do a terrific job. The other thing that you got to consider is how are we going to edge our bunkers. So once again, weed eaters have become much more popular for that. As I used to go do my visits for my students when they were in internship, I always tried to look for something on each golf course that kind of stood out to me. And at some point, when I was still with the superintendent and the student, before I met with the student alone, I would try to bring up what I saw that I really liked. They were always glad to hear that. They always appreciated that. And I remember I was at one golf course, the Glacier Club in Colorado, Durango, Colorado. Beautiful golf course. And one of the things that I noticed, and this has as we were going around, the bunkers were perfectly edged but didn't look like they were edged. So when you first edge around a bunker, you've got this cut-off edge that the sod shows and some dirt shows and things like that, depending on how it's raked. And when you use a weed eater a lot of times, that edge can get a little scalped in places. Well, whoever they had doing these bunkers just did a perfect job. I just was blown away with how even each one of those were. And I mentioned this to the superintendent when we were pretty much done with our tour, and he said, well, he says, thank you. He says, we take great pride in that. He says, I've had the same crew doing this for 6 years, the bunkers, and they are the best I've ever seen. Now, I don't know that I'd like to do the same job for 6 years, but he did say that they really they liked doing that job because it was kind of their specialty. So when you get into freeform areas, you gotta see, is there any kind of steerability to this? And then, like I said, bunker maintenance, and then bunker renovation. So there's different types of machinery that you can use for each of those situations. And I should have some pictures. Okay, so here's a little three-wheel edger by Black & Decker. It's electric. That probably wouldn't work on a golf course, but just kind of showing you how that works. So that can just be a little bit more maneuverable than some of the others. So sidewalks, patios, and driveways. They do make, I have one at home, not that brand, and it is basically a weed eater that has wheels that pop down like this and the head rotates, so it looks like this Black & Decker, but it's rechargeable. It just works great for me. Does not have a blade. It uses string, like a string trimmer, and it just works really, really well. And I like that. I don't, for my home use, I don't really want a gas-powered one. So here's a little bit bigger one with a blade. You can see down here the blade here, and a gas engine, and it has 4 wheels. Now this is really good for sidewalk, patios, and driveways. It works really, really good. It's a little bit tougher to use on freeforms and bunkers and things like that, although you could. It's just hard to maneuver this around. One of the things I like about this particular unit is you can vary the depth of the blade, how low it goes with this arm. Now this one's interesting. This is called a bihoe, and it has 1 wheel, 2 handles, and so you can easily maneuver this around. A lot of golf courses use this, and they're pretty effective. My only complaint with these is they don't tend to last as long as some of the others. But like I say, there's just 1 wheel here, so it makes it very easy to turn corners with it. And the issue here is it's got great steerability. Okay, now I included this for edgers because you can rotate the head, and then typically you can rotate the handle to hold it. This takes practice. You're not going to start out being great at this right from the get-go. But people, once they really learn it, they can be very fast with this, and it can work very, very well. So the next one I'm going to show you is an interesting machine, and it would be for bunker renovation. This thing is can be rotated around, but it's got a lot of power, and it's cutting a new edge. And the other thing is, some of these, like this one, has an L-shaped blade, so it actually comes down and goes across, so it creates a little shelf, but it actually pulls all the stuff away to easily clean it. And it's so first of the season, after a long winter or whatever, or maybe one other time, you might use this to reintroduce the edges for your bunkers. String trimmers, well, once again, you kind of have to just determine what's the scope of work, and so what's the size or power you want. Now my string trimmer that I use at home, like I say, is rechargeable battery. Not for use for a landscape company, for a school, just for a home lawn. It's small. Before that, I had a plug-in electric one that I used for years, and ended up, after 20-some years, giving it to my son because I didn't want to mess with the cord anymore, and so I got a cordless. Works fine for the home lawn, but it's not going to work in larger situations. So this is an example of a electric string trimmer. Very light, easy to use. but once again, not for large areas. Okay, then we get into some gas units. That are for a little bigger areas, landscapers and things like that, school districts, golf courses, a lot of string trimmers for trimming around trees and bunker edges and things like that. And then this one I put in there because this one was interesting to me because it's multi-purpose. It detaches. So this is what they call the power head, and then the bottom unit somewhere around right here detaches, and you can change it to a different unit. For example, different types of heads. It's not what I wanted. Okay, so you can have blades and string and whatever, saw blades. We used to have a saw blade that we used to put on one that we used for trimming hedges. Miserable job, hated it, but it was what needed to be done. Another one, okay, here's a hedge trimmer that you can put on one of those pole units to make it multi-purpose. And then a small chainsaw. Now, I like having a small chainsaw. At home, I hardly ever use a chainsaw. So the one I've had for probably 25 years. It's a Craftsman. It's a 10-inch electric chainsaw. Now, if I was going to cut my own firewood and had a lot of trees on my property and things like that, it wouldn't work. But for what I want, it works fine. And once again, for golf courses and things like that, probably you'll have your own chainsaws, bigger chainsaws. But for trimming and things like that, because it's on a pole, these can be very, very helpful. Think about this being on a 6-foot long pole, the reach that you can have with that to get it places. So they just can be very helpful. And then I included this one. We had a multi-purpose weed eater that we had a chainsaw unit for it, and we also had one of these units, just a little tiny rototiller attachment, and we did that for flower beds on the golf course, and we used to have small flower beds around each of the tee signs, and so we would use this to clean them up every year, and it's just a lot faster and a lot more. I mean, a rototiller, we had that too, but that was just too big for most of the areas that we were going to use. So then we have chainsaws, and they come in just tons of different sizes, depending on the job that you want to do, and most golf courses will have probably more than one, because trees are part of life on a golf course. And so just determining, and I'm not recommending any brands here. It's just the picture that I was able to get that showed what I wanted it to show. Safety bar on this is very important. Used to be that they were 2 cycles. Almost all of this stuff now is 4 cycle, because 2 cycles are very polluting and they're hard to maintain, I think. So, but they come in different sizes. A pretty typical one might be a 16 or an 18-inch, 14-inch on a golf course. It's, once again, depending on what you're going to cut with it. And this one's just a little bit bigger, and so I was just showing that, and then a couple of them. Blowers. Okay, now these have come a long ways. So, some people will have handheld. I don't think too much of these would be found on golf courses. They would be more for homeowners and things like that. I have a handheld blower. Actually, I have 2. I have an electric one. I get pretty tired of the cord, so I was able to, when a neighbor was moving, I was able to get a little John Deere 4-cycle blower, and I like it a lot better. But it is, once again, it's a handheld blower. They also make backpack type ones for most of the landscapers would use this in golf courses for little areas where they're going around. Typically, my guy who is doing pin placements, depending on the time of the year, he might take a backpack blower with him so that if there were any debris on the golf course, he could, on the green, he could just clean that off. Work pretty well. Walk behind. The first golf course I worked at when I graduated from high school, we didn't have backpack or handheld blowers, but we did have walk behind blowers. They were gas engines, and you would use them and just walk back and forth across the green. The difference is they just simply put out more air than what a backpack or a handheld would. And so they were just a little bit more effective if you had greens that you needed to clean off. And we had a lot of trees on the golf course where I was, and so when leaves would start to fall and things like that, that became a little more important. Equipment mounted blowers. I remember somewhere in the first 3 or 4 years that I was at the golf course in Portland that I worked at first, Glendevere, we purchased this, we had walk behinds, but we purchased this tractor mounted blower. And you got to understand, Glendevere, most of the fairways have Douglas fir trees all over the golf course, along every fairway. So any type of a windstorm was going to create a mess. And can you imagine trying to clean that up with small blowers? And even what we used to use is we would just, the whole crew would go out there, walk down a fairway with pitchforks, removing the junk up. It was just time consuming. It was not something I enjoyed at all. And we bought this equipment mounted, this tractor mounted power takeoff blower. And my word, the difference that it would make in terms of cleaning the fairways off, in terms of cleaning the roughs out, it was pretty amazing machine. That machine probably paid for itself in one season, I'm sure, and it was a type of machine that would last for 20 years. It was just an incredible machine, great time saver. So, a few pictures, just a handheld. This one happens to have a small 2-cycle gas engine in it. Wouldn't be my choice. This one is a little bit bigger. It has a 4-cycle engine on it, but once again is handheld. This is a pretty common type of backpack. They used to be pretty finicky. I think they're better nowadays. And they're nice because they're a lot bigger engines. They put out a lot more air, and with the straps you can have them on your back, and it just makes it easier. Okay, here is a walk behind blower, and golf courses still might have this because we don't really like to take heavy equipment on the greens, and we just don't. And so this could be an option for something like that, for walking across the green. Just another version of that, just a little bit bigger. This one, I'll show you this one here. If you can notice the difference, the main difference to me, while I would pick this one over the last one, is the front wheel swivels. And I like that. Also, it has a diverter on it to where, and I'll show you that right. Here's the swivel wheel. Here's the diverter, to where you can have the blower go straight out this way, or it diverts it and has it blows across the other way. Here's the unit that I'm talking about, and ours didn't have this on it. This is a diverter, once again, to make it go, instead of coming out this way, it makes it go this way. But this is the power takeoff bar that goes on the tractor, and generates a lot of air, and really works well in bigger situations for cleaning things up. A vacuum only does a swath as wide as the vacuum, so let's say it's 4.5 or 5 feet, where this thing can clean a path, depending on how deep it is, 5 to 15 feet or more. So they're very, very practical. Say this was an incredibly great piece of equipment for us to buy. Here's another version of the same thing, and include this picture because of the diverter, so you can see that. This just simply lifts up out of the way so the air can blow out this way, or if the diverter's on, the air blows this way. This one's kind of neat in that they added a little tow bar to it. So after they start it, they can pull it behind a small garden tractor or any kind of a mower, something like that. Pretty effective way to use that and to make it easier on the employee. I want to laugh because some employers don't care if they make it easier on the employee. I always felt like if we could do that, we were going to try some way to do that to make it easier on the employee. Okay, so in conclusion with the blowers, between and a lot of golf courses probably wouldn't have too much in the way of vacuums, but they probably would have both blowers and leaf sweepers depending on if they have trees. If they don't have trees, then they probably don't need it. But if they have trees, they do need that. The first golf course I was on, Glendevere, I remember when I was 12 years old, on October 12th, which is when I'm recording this video, October 12th, 1962, so who knows, that's a lot of years ago, 55, we had a storm in Portland. It was whatever you call, it was like a hurricane, but it was inland from the coast in. It was, and we had winds of up to 130 miles an hour. And I remember as a 12-year-old kid, or 11 at the time, it was pretty amazing to me. And I remember it was on a Friday, and I remember the next day going to the golf course with my dad and driving around looking at the damage, the trees that were down. Now, this golf course was on about 170 acres. It was 36 holes, mostly Douglas fir. The thing that I remember distinctly about that was I didn't see a blade of grass on the entire golf course. It was all covered with debris. This was before we had a blower or anything like that. I'm glad I wasn't working there then. Okay, that will bring us to small sprayers. Now, handheld sprayers, backpack sprayers, four-wheel sprayers, small skid sprayers, and we'll talk about each one of these. And so I have handheld sprayers. I have actually 3 of them. 2 that I use routinely. Now, mine are a little different now, maybe as I've gotten older or whatever, but I have one that is battery powered, and I'll use it until it quits. And the newest one that I got is rechargeable battery powered. Now, the reason I really like the battery powered is because the pressure is constant. You don't have to pump it up. It works really, really well. You get a constant spray. My rechargeable one is of a design where it's got a demand pump, so if you're not spraying, the pump just shuts off or pulses very, very slowly until you spray. It just works fantastic. And it's sometimes I will put it in front of me on my between my legs and my lawnmower, and I will use my lawnmower to go around and spray if I'm feeling lazy or whatever, or if I've got a lot to spray. It just works really, really well. Once again, there are places on any situation where a hand sprayer, a handheld sprayer, is going to be what you want. Now, why do I have 2? Well, I have one that I use for Roundup only, period. That's all that ever goes in that sprayer. Because Roundup is pretty much non-selective in my situation. It is selective, but non-selective in terms of weeds and grasses. I don't want to take the risk of contamination being left in that. So, and because I do a lot of Roundup around my yard and flower beds and stuff like that, it just makes sense to have that. The other sprayer, then, I can put whatever I want in, either weed killers or insecticides, whatever I want to use it for. And I don't mind cleaning those out and using them, so I just have two, and that works out well for me. So here's a couple of backpack sprayers, and just different sizes, 1.5 liter and a 2 liter, or 20 liter. I'm not sure. I think that's what it is. Yeah, 15 liter and 20 liter. They get a little nicer. Here's the arm for pumping them up. But once again, my only complaint with this is they can be inconsistent. So, you know, okay, here is one that's mounted on a small utility vehicle, a four-wheeler. So they've taken this four-wheeler, and this shows without, and this shows with it on there. Typically, they will run off the battery, and they will have a demand pump. They're great for doing small areas, for doing spot spraying around a golf course or a landscape, or if you've got a little more land. They work really, really well for that. Okay, now we have a little bit bigger sprayer, what we would call a small skid, in that it slides in here, and it typically will have its own engine, although for a long time we had one that the Cushman had a power takeoff, and it ran off of that. Notice this one has booms. That's pretty typical. It might also have a hand sprayer that you can select to use instead of the booms. So they make these in a lot of different sizes, different boom sizes, and kind of the newest invention that we've seen with sprayers, and there's, I don't know, 4 or 5 in the Northwest that would have these, where they also have GPS systems in them. And so, and actually the one I'm thinking of could be driverless, which is pretty amazing. So somebody goes out with a GPS unit, drives around the green, and he hits just a button on the GPS unit as he drives around the outside edge of where he's going to spray, and it marks this off. So then when this unit, with driver or not, comes on, then all of the nozzles on this boom are controlled by this GPS unit. It's a little more complicated than that, but basically that's what it does. And so this GPS unit, as it sprays, tracks where it is sprayed. So let's say the guy, when he comes back around, he can't see where he sprayed before, and he overlaps 2 feet. Now, depending on the chemical, if he overlapped 2 feet and he sprayed this 2 feet strip a second time, it could be harmful to the grass, but at the very least it's very wasteful. So what this GPS unit does is it turns on and off the nozzles, and because you've gone across this certain area, it knows what has been sprayed and what hasn't. And they're doing this on farms all the time, and it saves money, it saves time, and it's very precise. And that's one of the things that we like, is the precision of it. So the next part that I want to talk about is utility vehicles. Every golf course has utility vehicles, and they come in various sizes. When I first started out, we did have Cushmans. They didn't have steering wheels, they had handlebars, and they were 3-speed manual transmissions on the column, and typically 1-seater, 3-wheelers. That's what we had, was 3-wheelers. That's what they were back then. And we had a couple of those, and they were great for zipping around the golf course. Plus, we had a couple of older pickups that we used on the golf course too. We had one pickup. It was a now you got to remember, this was in 1967. It was a 1949 Chevy, and the doors were off of it, and it was pretty beat up. It had 11,000 miles on it. So it was 20 years old, had 11,000 miles, and was on its 3rd engine. Simply because when you never drive something over 15 miles an hour in first gear, the engines tend to wear out fast. So utility vehicles have become the choice. So we have runabouts, where the idea is to get you from one place to another. They don't have to haul big loads. They can carry some things, but they're just to get you from one place to the other. A glorified golf cart, maybe. Typically, they will have a fixed box on them. Then the next type is what we would call multi-purpose, a little bit heavier. They could have a fixed box or a dump bed on there. It might be a manual dump bed, it might be a hydraulic dump bed, but it's just a little bigger, a little more multi-purpose. Now, what you have to remember is the weight of the vehicle as you go from a roundabout to a multi-purpose increases, the price increases, and the fuel usage increases. So it's just a matter of picking the right choice for the right job. So here's a typical runabout type thing. This is basically it's a golf cart, a club cart, golf cart, where they have put a little bit bigger tires, a little bit heavier springs, typically the same engine, maybe a little bigger, but this fixed box on the back. This is great for getting around the golf course. Typically these are like a golf course in that whenever you stop, the engine dies. And when you start, it starts and then goes. And we'll have a parking brake. So once again, that's a small utility vehicle, a runabout with a fixed box. This one, I just saw this picture. This is the same thing, only it's got a longer bed, a longer wheelbase down here. You can see this longer wheelbase here for hauling bigger things, but it still doesn't need to do a ton of work. So this one would be another example of a runabout, just a glorified golf cart. And I included a few pictures of those. This one would be more of a larger runabout. Could almost be a multi-purpose, but what I would still consider a runabout. But it has beefier suspension, probably a bigger engine, and bigger wheels and tires. Not sure that you would have this on a golf course as much as maybe a farming operation, something like that. This one, once again, this is just a runabout, my least favorite of all the runabouts. I've never cared for gators very much. I don't know why. I think they're uncomfortable for one thing. I'm a big guy. They're hard to get in and out of, and I don't know, just not my favorite thing. But they're very popular. So, and they're well made. Okay, this would be more of what we would call just once again a little bit bigger runabout with bigger springs. If it looks a lot like the Easy Go, it's because it's made by the same company. This one's just Jacobson, but they're made by the same company. A pretty popular type of runabout, a small Toro Workman. I kind of like these. They're pretty comfortable. Something about having this box I kind of like. It washes out very easy, and being kind of a plastic material, it just doesn't deteriorate quite as fast. So, there's just all kinds of different ones out there. Multi-purpose then gets a little bit bigger. A lot of times they will have bigger engines. They will have power takeoff units, things like that. So, okay. I don't have, I wonder why I don't have that. Okay. They do make a much larger utility vehicle. Both Toro and John Deere make one. They call it a Pro Gator and a Workman. And while I don't care for the regular Gators, the Pro Gators are fantastic units, and the Workmen are fantastic units too. Dump beds, typically bigger engines, can put a variety of equipment on them to use, and so that's anything that's doesn't matter so much the size, but anything that you can add stuff to equipment wise is what I would call multi-purpose. Okay, and just some of the equipment that you can get, attachments. Here's a pull behind spreader. Great little unit. Great little unit. We had one like this at a course I was at, and we had one that actually mounted on the back of the utility vehicle that was battery powered. This one is ground driven, in that as the wheels turn, it turns gears that turns this rotating propellers for spreading the fertilizer, and an on and off switch. Ours that we had pulleys on each side and a rope that you could have up by where you were driving for turning it on and off. Or, and then like say with electrical motors. Small little sprayer attachment. Not probably for a golf course, but if I had maybe a little more land, that might be something that I would consider. This attachment is a brush, a rotating brush that can clean up areas. This one is just a blade for pushing snow or whatever, or pushing dirt. That is an attachment. A utility trailer. I have kind of a small utility trailer that gardening, I just call it a gardening trailer, that I used to pull behind my Craftsman riding lawnmower, small garden tractor type. Now I've had to change that a little bit because I have a Toro zero turn, but I hooked up a little pin on that to where I can pull my trailer behind it. Okay, here's the large heavy-duty utility vehicle. This is a Workman. The design has changed a little bit. I had one of the first Workmans in the east side of Washington. That was a fantastic unit. The attachments that we could put on that were amazing. We had a sprayer that would fit in the back of that. We had a core harvester that went on this side. We talked about that last week. It was a Cushman core harvester, but it was we bought a kit where it would fit on this Toro. And the reason I like the Toro is because it turns very, very sharp, and it drives really, really good. And we put wood sides on 3 sides of this, so the plugs from the airifying could go on the back, and it had a dump box. I was trying to think what else we had for that. We did have a fertilizer spreader that would fit in the back of that too. And we actually, here, we could take this bed off. It just had a couple of pins, and we could pull this bed off, and we had a top dressing unit that would fit right on this unit and hook up to the PTO. Pretty slick. And like I say, John Deere makes one too. And it works very, very well also. Very good unit. And once again, the heavy duty, you see, there's one I wanted to show you of a heavy duty utility vehicle with a spreader on the back. Ours wasn't like this. Ours was a Toro spreader. This one is really a great spreader. It's called a Vicon, and it really throws the material. It has you can hardly see it, but it has kind of a tube here. And as the sand goes through, this thing rotates back and forth. And so it really gives a pretty nice distribution. This was an infield mat, kind of like a larger version of a sand trap rake for prepping the infield and then dragging it out with these rakes behind. This was kind of a scarifier here that would loosen things up, and this would go behind to rake it out nicely. Notice it's behind the tires, so you don't leave any tire tracks. This is a pull behind spreader that goes on behind the utility vehicle, and I wanted to show that because it shows you how this brush that's across here throws the sand. It's really nice because the sand has to be dry to drag it in. I threw this in here. I've only seen a couple of these on a utility vehicle. They make larger one of these, but this is a small tree spit, and so it has blades that are up and out of the way here, and this one opens up to go around the tree. You go around the tree, these slice into the turf and create a root ball. You can lift it up hydraulically, move it to someplace else, put it back down, retract these blades on these arms, open it up, and you've replanted the tree. This one kind of fits both under attachments and then under blowers. This is a newer type of blower, and they are fantastic blowers. You can rotate this too, but they really put out a lot of air, and they were a fantastic addition to the market. Buffalo blowers, and they're really cool. I thought this was pretty interesting. Once again, this is a sprayer, but the boom is right down at the ground with skirts so that there's no drift. Here's a bigger boom sprayer with wheels. Some of the ones that we have now are dedicated units, but they make them where they have laser sights on these and hydraulics, and this one, the nice thing about this is it will follow the contour of the ground. So if you go over a little rise, it'll lift up the boom. So it's pretty nice to have that. Once again, a sprayer. In my background, the golf courses I was at, I really felt like this type of sprayer was what we really wanted to have. That or a dedicated sprayer worked out really well. If I ever needed to use a huge sprayer, like a 300 or 400 gallon sprayer, I usually found a way to either rent that or borrow it, because most of the time we didn't need that. And I don't want to drive a tractor across the green, where I wouldn't be opposed to driving a utility vehicle across the green. Here's a dedicated sprayer single passenger, but that's all this unit does. They do make a version of this where this whole unit comes off and you can put a sand spreader on there. But in today's world, you do a lot of spraying, and so a dedicated sprayer makes sense to me. There's another one, a dedicated sprayer. This is pretty popular with the golf courses. A lot of this unit right here is a calibrating tool, and they've become a lot more sophisticated. We'll talk about calibration, although in today's world a lot of them are self-calibrating, but we're going to go through that process and at least talk about how you calibrate a sprayer. Okay, that's the end of week 4 lecture. Sorry I couldn't be here. I'm at the Inland Northwest Turf Expo, which combines the Inland Empire Golf Course Superintendents Association, the Idaho Golf Course Superintendents Association, and the Peaks and Prairies, which is Montana, Wyoming, some Utah's people will show up at that, and it should be very good. But that's where I will be next Tuesday. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.